There are a few people who are waiting, so I'm going to let them in. Okay.
No problem.
Okay. Okay. I'm trying to make this into this. Yes. Okay.
Please stop. Smile. Please mute.
All right.
Right now, you are.
Okay, I shall begin, right?
Yes.
Okay, so hello
Mute,
everyone. My name is Guliz. I assume that Abdul Shakur has told you guys about me. I am teaching political science and politics of the Middle East at Yildirim Beyazıt University, and today I will begin sort of giving you an introduction to the Middle East politics and give you some historical background. Okay, so when we talk about the Middle East, what are we talking about? Well, there is the League of Arab States that has 22 members, and the Arab League was founded in 1945. This is after World War II. And some of these countries have been, if you think about it, have gained their independence later on and joined the Arab League. Apart from the Arab states, we have 3 non-Arab states in the Middle East: Israel, Turkey, and Iran. And if you look at the list of Arab states, you'll see that it includes the 3 regions, 3 sub-regions. So North Africa, Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, Morocco, but there are also sub-Saharan states: Comoros Islands, Djibouti, Mauritania, Somalia, and Sudan. And there is a second sub-region called the Fertile Crescent, and this includes Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, and Turkey, and the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula states: Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Yemen, and Iran. So I want to show you the map here. It's not a great map, but it will do. So this shows, if you see across the Mediterranean here, North Africa, and also the Gulf states, as well as the Fertile Crescent. So the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, and the rest, and Syria, Jordan, Palestine. Those are sort of the Lebanon, sort of the Fertile Crescent. But it doesn't include all of this, doesn't include all of what we think of as the Middle East. This is just the 2-3 regions. Okay. If we think about the boundaries of the Middle East, well, there were historically different names used to refer to this area: Al-Iraq, Shat al-Arab, Al Jazeera, Sham, Misr. So Middle East as a term was the invention of the Europeans. And the states that are in the Middle East today are the boundaries of those states. The borders were mostly determined as a result of the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire and also the European intervention, which I will talk about the Ottomans and the European colonial period, imperialist period. But the term Middle East that we use today is a British invention around World War II, and they were trying to figure out a way to a term to use that was between their most prized colony, which was India, and the Ottoman lands and the Russian Empire. And they called this area the Near East. At first, it was called the Near East. Then, when the Americans came along, it was more of a term that moved towards the Middle East, okay? And around World War II, Near East was sort of debunked, and Middle East started to be used. Sometimes you will see the term MENA, Middle East and North Africa. So the Middle East used from Egypt. So let me show you another map here. Where's my other map? There we go. Okay, so from Egypt to Turkey to Iran and the Gulf. So that is usually called the Middle East, and plus the North African states, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. So that is usually what is referred to as Middle East and North Africa. But when we add the other sub-Saharan states, so that's the Arab League. So this is ambiguous. When we talk about the Middle East, there are some countries that are added sometimes, other times they're excluded, because it's a Eurocentric term. But even the people in the region use the term Middle East now, so it's pretty common. So then let's talk about the latest episode, that the latest historical phenomenon that has shaped the Middle East today, which is the Arab uprisings of 2011. This was more than a decade now ago, and none of the countries were not affected. So they were all affected. And if you think about countries that were that came out okay from the Arab uprisings, that their leaders weren't changed, still they were challenged, such as Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Jordan, Morocco, Kuwait, Oman. So all of these countries were affected. And if you I want you to pay attention to the fact that except for Sudan, all of the rest of these countries are Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Morocco, and Oman are monarchies, and they have a king. But even the kings were challenged. They didn't change, except for Saudi Arabia here, but it wasn't due to the Arab uprisings that the king changed. So we will talk a little bit about how these countries are governed today as well. But even the monarchies were affected. The countries that were most affected were the ones whose leaders changed: Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Yemen. These countries each had a dictator. Tunisia had Bin Ali, Libya had Gaddafi, Egypt had Mubarak, and Yemen had Ali Abdullah Saleh. So all of these dictators left due to the Arab uprisings. 2 leaders remained. This doesn't mean that these countries were not affected. Syria has been ruled by Assad throughout this time, during the uprisings and afterwards, but Syria is now going through a civil war. And it's very brutal, and it's now internationalized, not only the regional actors, but also global actors are active. And Bahrain, King Hamad, these two leaders remained, but their countries have been changed dramatically and challenged. So how about the legacy of the Arab uprisings? Syria, Yemen, and Libya, there is an ongoing civil war. So all Syria, the same leader, Yemen and Libyan leaders changed, but these three are still wrecked by civil war. What else? Jordan and Morocco, kings, these two are kings, they're monarchies. They are introduced, these two kings introduced limited reforms, but remained in power. King Abdullah and King Mohammed VI. In Egypt and Tunisia, there was regime change. Just give me. Okay, so I want to also explain what a regime is. Regime, usually when we think about regime, we tend to, in the Middle East, we tend to refer to the Sisi regime, or in the olden days, it was Saddam regime, as if regime means a personal dictatorship rule. But regime actually means not the people who are in power at a particular point in time, but the rules by which a leader is elected or selected or comes to power, and how that leader actually rules, whether he or she rules by consulting other actors, or just personal dictatorship or military junta. All of these, how a leader comes to power and how that leader governs the country overall is referred to as a regime. So in Egypt and Tunisia, there was regime change. In Egypt, Mubarak left and Muslim Brotherhood came to power. And unfortunately, this democratic experiment in Egypt was very short-lived. In 2013, the Muslim Brotherhood president Morsi was removed by a military coup only a year later. Now we have Sisi, who is more repressive than Mubarak was. In Tunisia, just until last year, we were calling Tunisia the only country who actually was managing very well the transition to democracy, and we're calling the country multi-party democracy. But unfortunately, in 2022, the president who was chosen, Kais Saied, carried out what we call a self-coup, and abolished the parliament and the government, and now is moving the country towards authoritarian rule. Okay. So a lot of people talk about whether Arab Spring was a success or a failure. What we cannot do now is whether it was a complete success or failure. A lot of people will say, well, because there's civil wars now in Syria, Yemen, and Libya especially, it was better under the dictatorship. Well, yes and no, because there was stability, but underneath that stability, there was a lot of human rights violations, a lot of violence underneath the veneer of stability. And what we also need to remember is that Arab Spring or Arab uprisings came as a surprise to many in the West, especially, but overall, there was this belief that the Arab countries were authoritarian and stable. They were that there would not be any movement or any uprising that called for democracy. And so when the Arab uprisings came along, people were surprised. But this vision, this view is actually totally wrong, because the region has a long history of resistance. And there is the anti-colonial movement of the 19th and early 20th century. There's the nationalist and independent movements of the mid-20th century, and ongoing protests. Even in countries that are most repressive, there were protests throughout the 20th century, especially against economic practices that benefit the few. There were demonstrations. This was prior to the Arab Spring, okay? Demonstrations against foreign intervention in the region in a variety of ways. So there was always foreign intervention, but there was always demonstrations. There were always resistance against this foreign intervention, okay? Whether it be a military intervention, investment of development projects, there were bread riots, there are riots against taxation, there are riots, there are protests by the labor movements. There's always protest movements. There's 150 years of history behind the Arab Spring. So we should not think of the Arab Spring as coming out of nothing, okay? There is also another, there we go. So then we have had ongoing uprisings after the 2011, the first round of uprisings. So some people called it Arab Spring 2.0. In 2018, 19 and 20, there were protests. So Algeria, there were protests following President Bouteflika's announcement to run a 5th term. In Sudan, Omar al-Bashir was ousted by a military coup following protests where actually women were pretty much at the forefront. In Iraq, protests against corruption, and later Iranian and US intervention, and President Barham Saleh remains in office. This was of course, there's new elections, and I didn't include that in here. So this is different. Lebanon is totally wrecked by economic mismanagement, corruption, and there were protests in 2020, even during the COVID pandemic. People didn't care because it's really, really, really dire situation in Lebanon economically. In Iran, of course, there's an ongoing protest against the regime now. The protests that started with, there were protests in 2019 that was against the gas prices, against the increase in gas prices. But the current protests in 2022, this has evolved into calls for overthrowing of the regime. So Middle East is still experiencing protests, and probably there is going to be more and more coming up, because the problems that people rose up against during the Arab uprisings have become worse. Okay. Okay, so let's give you a few some information about the region as a whole. Okay, so when we talk about the Middle East in all these countries, we talk about usually majority of the region is Arab and they speak Arabic, but like I said, there are non-Arab countries in the Middle East. Iran, Turkey, and Israel. In Israel, people speak Hebrew, but there's a lot of Arabic speaking as well. In Iran, people speak Farsi, and then in Turkey, we speak Turkish. But we need to remember that even though majority of the population is Muslim, there were historically a lot more Christian communities and Jewish communities as well in the region. And currently in Lebanon, 40% of the population is Christian, and in Egypt, about 10 to 20% of the population is still Christian, Coptic Christians. Okay, so in terms of geography, the largest countries in terms of geography are Algeria and Saudi Arabia, followed by Libya and then Iran. And the smallest are Bahrain and Palestine. Look how small Bahrain is, only 771 square kilometers. In terms of population, Turkey, Egypt, and Iran are sort of the powerhouses of population, over 80 million people in Egypt, Turkey, and Iran. Then the smallest, again, Bahrain. In terms of urbanization, urban population as a percentage of the total, it's 90%, over 90% of Israelis, Kuwaitis, and Emiratis or Qataris are actually living in urban environment, whereas Yemen is only 35%. So there is a big difference there in terms of the percentage of urbanization within the region. In terms of the economy, Yemen actually is, Yemen has in terms of economic output, the worst economy, followed by Palestine and Egypt. Yemen is wrecked by civil war, and there is malnourishment. There is basically humanitarian crisis that has been going on for the last almost 8 years now. So in terms of GDP per capita, there is also huge differences. You have the oil-rich states that are, as you see here, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar. Those are countries that are doing really well if you think of GDP per capita. These countries are also countries whose populations, especially the little Gulf countries, they have very little populations. And if you look here, United Arab Emirates have GDP per capita about $40,000. It's on par with westernized countries. Qatar, $66,000. Kuwait, $35,000, whereas Yemen, it's $680. there's a huge disparity within the Middle East in terms of GDP per capita, in terms of economic development. The literacy rate as well, but it has increased quite a bit over the years. The lowest is actually Iraq. Here it's 38%. A little bit higher than that is Yemen. Whereas Turkey, for example, 93%, and Kuwait, Jordan, 97 to 95%. So very high. Among the and these are 2016 numbers, of course, and a lot has changed since the COVID pandemic. So things have changed a little bit, but in terms of the relative differences, I think they're pretty much the same. Okay. So what I want to talk about now is the regimes. Like I said, a regime is not those in power. Those in power we call the government. Regime is about who, how the leaders of a country are elected and how they govern. And the countries in the Middle East, one of the characteristics of the Middle East politically has been that it was governed by authoritarian regimes. Okay, and except for a few. And not only that, when you have authoritarian regimes, you have what do authoritarian regimes look like? Okay, so leaders are not elected through elections that are free and fair. And there is relatively a narrow group of individuals who have a say in how the country is governed, and they control the state and its institutions, and they're not held accountable to the public. And one of the other characteristics of authoritarian regimes is political rights and civil liberties are very limited. So what are political rights? Political rights are right to be elected, to elect your government officials, to organize into parties and compete in elections without interference from other forces such as the military or other powerful groups. So these are political rights. And civil liberties are freedom of expression and belief, freedom of association and organization, rule of law, and individual rights. So this table is showing the country's scores done by Freedom House. Freedom House is a global NGO that calculates political rights and civil liberties of all the countries in the world every year. And they make this calculation and they give numbers to political rights and civil liberties of each country. And when you see a 1, it's mostly free. When you see a 7, it's least free. And then there is the middle, which is partly free. Okay, so free, not free, and partly free. So if you see high scores, that means not free. That means political rights and civil liberties are very limited. And if you see here, you see a lot of 6s and 5s and 7s, except for a few countries. And Israel has received a high score here, but I think under the current government, they're probably going to receive a lot higher scores. And so that means, in general, the region is characterized by authoritarian regimes. But what kind of authoritarian regimes? There are different kinds of authoritarian regimes, okay? So one of the interesting thing about the Middle East also is that it has a high concentration of monarchies, which is not so prevalent in the world anymore. But you have also familial monarchies, a patriarchal dominant king or an emir, who's sort of a father figure. There is no power above the king or the emir. And these countries are mostly the Gulf states: Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman. Okay. So these are led by monarchies in general, are led by kings, and the succession is hereditary. So from father to son, or the father to the brother of the king, or there's no elections to choose the leader, and the ruling family has the most power. Okay. And in the constitutional monarchies, there's still the Jordan, Morocco, Iran under the Shah. No longer is Iran a monarchy. Don't confuse that. Before the Iranian Revolution, there was Iran was a monarchy, and they called their kings the Shah. Okay, so Jordan currently today under King Abdullah, and Morocco are constitutional monarchies. That means they have a legislature, but it's very limited authority, and they have a bureaucracy, and they have a constitution, but still the ruling family, and the king in particular, has the last say. Okay, so their legislatures are very limited in power. And throughout their independent period, these monarchies have been supported by colonial and foreign powers to stay in power. Okay, so there is monarchy, and there is also another type of government here, revolution regime, another type of authoritarianism, which is revolutionary republic. Okay. And we tend to divide the revolutionary republics into two: personalistic authoritarian leadership versus dominant party ideology. This is still we can really, I mean, this division is very fluid, because in all of these republics, there were dictators that ruled for 20, 30, 40 years. But in some countries, there is no the party ideology has been weakened, such as Libya, Syria, Yemen, and Iraq. In Libya, you had Gaddafi. In Syria, you had the Ba'ath regime. Baathism is an ideology, sort of an Arab socialist ideology, but with Hafez Assad, this ideology has given way more to personalistic authoritarian leadership. In Yemen, you had Ali Abdullah Saleh, and in Iraq, Saddam Hussein. In Iraq, there was also a Ba'ath party, but Saddam Hussein ruled without the confines of the Ba'ath party ideology. Okay. Algeria, Egypt, Mauritania, Tunisia, and South Yemen, PDR is People's Democratic Republic of Yemen. These countries were ruled also by dictators, but there was a dominant party ideology. So, like I said, both types of republics relying on a single dominant party and periodically held non-democratic elections to demonstrate popular support to regime. So it's interesting. In monarchies, there is no election really for the top official. Okay, there's the king. There might be elections for legislature or some kind of councils, local councils, but in republics, there have been periodic elections. These are non-democratic elections, but nonetheless, there is under authoritarian regimes elections. And one of the reasons for that is the leaders want to have this sort of legitimacy and to make people show their support to the regime. And so they held elections. How much time has passed?
10, 14.
No. How much time has passed? Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
finish there.
Okay. So there are some outliers to this authoritarianism. Turkey and Israel, these countries have been products of the 19th century nationalism, Turkish nationalism, and Zionism, which is Jewish nationalism, really. They're products of 19th century nationalism inspired by Western style political modernization rather than family-oriented personalistic style of rule. So then they're both secular. Well, there's now the secularity is questioned by, especially in Israel, because they're more and more the Jewish domination in terms of the more religiously affiliated Jews being in power, the secular nature of the country is now questioned more and more, and formally democratic. So there's been elections, there's multi-party politics, free and fair elections. So these two are outliers. Like I said recently, the role of religion increasing in politics in both. There's one interesting thing to point out, that there's one group of states that are in the category of single party rule by personalistic leaders no longer exists, except for Bashar Assad in Syria. The rest have been toppled by the Arab Spring. Ben Ali in Tunisia, Mubarak in Egypt, Gaddafi in Libya, Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen, and were toppled by Arab uprisings, and Saddam Hussein was toppled by Iraq. So single party rule by personalistic leaders. There is no such category anymore. But maybe we can talk about Sisi regime as single party rule by personalistic leader, but maybe not. That's up for debate. There are other outliers, Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran. Lebanon and Iraq, they hold multi-party elections to determine the composition of parliaments and cabinets. Lebanon has been so since the Civil War, and Iraq since after the US invasion in 2003 and a new constitution. And but both are characterized by corruption, discriminatory practices, and presence of armed militias. So their democracy is very precarious and under threat. And so Iran is a category all on its own, because first of all, it's a theocracy. So it's ruled by religious clerics, but it's authoritarian as well as democratic. because it has a dual structure where there's a president and a parliament that are elected by popular vote, and there's competition among various factions. There is the hardliners, there's the moderates, there's the progressives, not many of them, probably not, but there's the hardliners and there is the moderates. And there's competition among various factions that has been very severe, really. And the presidency have been changing hands between the moderates and the hardliners. However, there is a council of guardians that is above the president and the parliament, who are secular features of the system. The council of guardians actually control who is going to run as candidates for the parliament and for the presidency for every elected office. Council of Guardians, and the Council of Guardians and above the Council of Guardians is the Supreme Leader. The ultimate power lies in the Supreme Leader, who is an Ayatollah and Khamenei, and he is indirectly elected and controls the army, the security forces, the judiciary, the media. So it is an authoritarian, and the authoritarian and the brutal aspect of the regime have been showing its face with the latest round of hangings of the young individuals who have been out on the street protesting. So the Iranian regime, Islamic Republic, is under threat by the latest protests as well. I just wanted to talk, not all of this, but I just want to talk a little bit about sort of the historical background, and if we have another session, maybe we can continue with it. So all three monotheistic religions have been have emerged in the Middle East, so which makes this part of the world very much contested among the three religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And Islamic empires ruled this country, this region, for a while. Then you had the Byzantines, who were Roman or Greek Orthodox, that were ruling Anatolia and parts of this region. And then you had the Seljuks and all of these different periods, but the latest single rule that encompassed all of the Middle East was the Ottoman Empire. So that's why the legacy of the Ottoman Empire to the Middle East is important. So what I will talk about is the Ottoman legacy and also the imperial legacy. So those two are important historical backgrounds. So one, the Ottoman rule, when we talk about legacy, what we mean is, what has this historical period of the Ottoman rule, what effects did it have on the current political structure and economic and social structures of the countries today? Okay, one is political institutions of the empire. There is a tradition of centralized, bureaucratized rule in the region. So all these countries in the region are pretty much have been affected by this centralized, bureaucratized rule. Some have resisted this rule, but some have adopted this rule. But all of them have been affected. the Ottoman response to European dominance, which was what we call Tanzimat, and the reform was to emulate Europeanization. So modernization came in the form of Europeanization in the Ottoman Empire, which has affected how states after their independence tried to modernize. The role of the military in terms of organization and role, the military has been at the forefront of modernization efforts and Europeanization efforts during the Ottoman period. And so in a lot of the countries, you will see very much military coups throughout the 20th century and ongoing. And so this has its roots in the Ottoman military's role in modernization. And lastly, the way that the Ottoman Empire integrated into the European economy, world economy. So it was in a dependent mode. Okay, the mode of relationship between the European and global economy and the Ottoman was one of dependency. So this has opened the gates to European increasing its influence on the Middle East. Okay, and lastly, what I'm going to mention is European imperialism. It has not been that long, except for Algeria. For Algeria, it's over 100 years. So if you look at this table, Algeria from 1830s to 1962, you have more than 130 years of imperial rule. In Egypt, you have imperial rule, and Tunisia, and Libya and Morocco. But so the British and the French, before World War I, they invaded countries. The British goal was to hold places that were on the route to India secure. So that's why they invaded Egypt. That's why they invaded the Gulf countries. So and there's another element here that has affected the imperial rule, which is the rivalry between France and Britain and among the big powers in Europe at the time in the 19th century. So whereas after World War I, you have what we call League of Nations, an international organization that was founded, which is the precursor to the United Nations, and the what you see as mandates here, mandate, those territories that were given to the British and the French by the League of Nations, and the whole purpose of a mandate was, it was not a colony per se, but it was the British mandatory state, the British and the French, the mandatory states were to help these countries become independent and develop. Okay. So last slide here, the impact of European rule. Just as the Ottomans left a legacy, the Europeans left a legacy too. And there, in terms of political legacy, there was a very much big spectrum. There was indirect rule in the Gulf versus direct rule in Algeria. In Britain, the British in the Gulf left the little emirs in place and allowed them to govern themselves domestically, but controlled the port and the foreign policy. And without the British control of this and the British support, these little emirs, I mean, these little countries would not have existed really today. Whereas France, on the other end of the spectrum, annexed Algeria. It totally destroyed the local religious institutions. They've destroyed the local tribes, and they brought in French people into the country. So totally assumed that France was that Algeria was part of France proper. Another impact was France and Britain drew maps of Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, Israel, and Palestine, and set up their political systems. So the maps, the boundaries between these countries in the region, as part of a big influence, is the boundaries are drawn by France and Britain. And so have their political systems been set up. There's also socioeconomic impact. Continuing on with the dependent position of the Ottomans, the colonies were used by the British and the French as markets for manufactured goods, and this destroyed their local economy, and the agricultural and primary products became the major exporting goods. And so lastly, culturally, Europeans look down on Islam. And so this is what we talk about when we talk about Orientalism. And and Europeans thought that, and they thought they were bringing civilization to what they called as Homo Islamicus. They did not think about Islam and Arab states, Arab countries, Arabs, as civilized. They were sort of half human in their minds. And so the white man was, in a way, burdened to bring civilization. This is how Europeans have no, I don't want it. I'm done almost here. So the Europeans have justified their imperialist practices through this cultural framework. But this has also brought another division within these societies as well, which was a divide between a Europeanized urban elite versus the rural masses that were clinging to the Arab or Islamic civilization, whereas the urban elite became Europeanized, and they wanted their country to become Europeanized. And this is going to be a major cleavage that is going to affect the countries once they gain independence. So this is all I have for today, actually. I thought that, is that okay?
Yes.
Okay. I think this was, you know, this was quite a long, it wasn't about an hour, I assume. So give the,
Maybe our students should have any questions.
yeah, sure.
Dear student, thank you so much for your participation to the class on time. So actually, really, thank you so much for our valuable professor for her time and energy. Really, it's not easy to provide in a lecture. The place where we are providing our lecture is too far with our professor home. Really, we need to understand. Really, thanks again to the professor. Dear student, I would like to request you, if you have any question, please, you can raise your question. Our professor will explain you what you have. Do you have any question regarding politics of Middle East or any, I don't know. If you have any question, please.
Yes, sir. I want to know
Next
what
time, maybe
role
we
is the
can make it
Middle
more
East
interactive.
right?
Yes, Elias. Can you raise again your question,
The
please?
one whole is the Middle East right? Yes, sir.
You can write also if your voice is not clear, you can write
I
your
want
question.
what?
Can you repeat again your question, please? Elias,
Yes, sir.
I can't
Right.
hear
I
anything.
want to know just it.
you want to know justice or what was your question? What is your question? Mr. Elias? In the camp, Hujam really network.
Of course, of course.
And Mr. Salam, also you can raise your question.
Okay, sir, I have no question. If our professor is so much, thank you for presentation.
Yes, sir. I have just one simple question. I want to know who created the
Oh.
Middle East?
We can't hear
What is the
you.
purpose to create Middle East?
I can't hear.
Okay, Mr. Silas, your question
Yeah, understand, I hope. Yes, my question is just why create the Middle East? What is the purpose to create about the Middle East?
Okay, your
Hello?
question is regarding Middle East.
Yes, I mean who created Middle East? Why?
Okay.
Sorry for that.
That's okay. Okay, so thank you for that. Basically, the creation was for imperial purposes in a way. The British needed to give a name to this region. And there was the Ottomans controlled what is currently today Turkey, what we call Anatolia, Syria, Iraq, the Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia, northern Africa. All of this region was controlled by the Ottomans. And so, but the Ottomans were weakening, and the Ottomans were losing power. And so the Europeans were gaining power, and the Europeans wanted to infiltrate into these lands, and they didn't. But the British controlled India, and so they needed to figure out how to name this region, and they said, okay, the Ottomans are retreating and there's now new developments here, so they called it the Near East first, which is what is the Far East? The Far East is China and Japan. So from their perspective, from the Europeans' perspective, this was their East, but they needed to distinguish between the Far East, China and Japan, India, and the Near East, which is closest to them. Then somehow for the Americans, even Europe is East, so they called the Americans were calling this area the Middle East. So that kind of stuck. So it is a Eurocentric term, but Orientalism, there's always South Orientalism, what we call. So Europeans coined the term, but we in this part of the world now adopted this term, and the Arab League, for example, they tried to come up with an institution that would bring together all of the Arab countries. How well could this work is another story, because some countries are working very closely with Western powers. Some countries are revolutionary. They want to go against the Western powers. So this has been the dilemma all throughout the 20th century, and it's ongoing. So we cannot really talk about the Middle East and this is the boundary and this is it's not, it is a very vague term. Sometimes, like in 30 years ago, if you told me that Turkey is part of the Middle East, I would totally refuse it, because Turkey had this identity of being part of Europe. Now, over the last 20 years, we made peace with the Arab countries, and so Turkey is more friendly with the Middle East, so it could be considered part of the Middle East now, but in 30 years, 20 years ago, it wasn't. So some countries are included sometimes, sometimes they're not included. So it is not a set in stone concept. Thank you for that question. That was great.
So much, dear professor. Yes, thank you so much to explain question. Yeah, I understand very well.
Now here is another question.
Thank you.
How old is the Middle East?
How old? It is basically the term that was coined at the turn of the century. So it's about a century old, about 120 years old. The term, the Middle East. In the region itself is very old. Obviously, the first civilizations that we know of, the ancient Egyptian civilizations, Sumerians, the ancient civilizations have lived here since time immemorial, but the term itself was never used by the people that lived in this part of the world until very recently. And so the term Middle East is about 130 years old.
Of Ilyas, you understand your question, your answer, right?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much to explain, dear professor.
Recording in progress.
Any question or so? Do you have any question? I saw you raise your hand.
Just Assalamualaikum, I have a question. That is, what are the different organs components for Mars care building in the Middle East? That is my question. What are the different vegan components for commercial dwelling in the Middle East?
What are the different regions,
Region?
components?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Okay. So we have three main regions. I'm going to show you that slide again. Let me see. Okay. So we have the North African countries. So see the Mediterranean Sea here? Mediterranean Sea borders both Africa and Europe. And then we have Turkey and Eastern Europe here. So on the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea here, you have North Africa. So that's one region. Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt. And Egypt is usually part of considered part of the Middle East. And when we add North Africa, we go all the way to Morocco. Okay. Then you have what we call the Fertile Crescent, which is at the heart of ancient civilizations. It includes Syria, Iraq, Turkey, part of Turkey, and Lebanon. So Israel, that area is sort of where all of the major civilizations in ancient world were located. Then you have the Gulf region, Yemen, Oman, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait. So the Gulf states. And why is it called the Gulf states? Because there's the Gulf here, right there where I have my cursor. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but Iran, Turkey, and Israel are outliers also because, okay, outliers because they are non-Arab, okay, because they're non-Arab. Oops, sorry. So these are the different regional, geographical regions, so to speak. Does that explain the question?
So if you understand your answer, right?
No, sir. No.
Is it match your question?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you so much for replying my question.
You're welcome.
Yes, something else to ask. Is there? Because our professor has many things to do. Really, she has spent too much time for us. If you have any question, please go on. So, कैसे question आता है?
I have a question, sir. Why did Turkey didn't agree at first in the Middle East?
Okay. That's a long question. That's a really good question.
Yes. Well, it has to do with the Ottoman history. Well, the Ottomans were founded in 1299, so they have a long history, and they have been ruling all the way from what we call the Balkans, which is sort of currently including Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Hungary, all the way sort of Central Asia, Central Europe, all the way to the Gulf. So, and North Africa. So it was covering a big chunk of territory. And then, and the Europeans were behind the Ottomans. Then slowly but surely, Europeans started to become more and more powerful. And the Ottomans realized that in order to be able to compete with the new European powers, they needed to Europeanize themselves. So the Ottoman state decided, the statesmen decided that they needed to modernize, they needed to adopt European military ways, European education, European technology. They needed to modernize the army. They needed to come up with even a Europeanized state system and a governing system. So the Ottomans, in the last 200 years of its existence, starting in the 19th century, beginning late 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, so last 250 years of its existence, have turned its face towards the West and wanted to be part of the Western powers. So when the Turkish Republic was founded by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, he was also of the same mind, that Europe was going to, Turkey was going to join Europe, and it was going to be part of Europe, basically. That was the only way it could survive as an independent nation, because all the other countries in the world have been colonized except for a few, and the Ottomans were one, and the Turkish Republic, the Ottomans were pretty much finished at the end of World War I. But the Mustafa Kemal Atatürk had rallied the Turkish people and founded the Turkish Republic, and so they didn't want to have anything to do with the old imperial territories. They wanted to protect the territories that it was able to gain at the end of the war. And another reason why the founding father of Turkish Republic didn't want to have anything to do with the Arabs was because the story goes that the Arabs didn't help us in quotations, help the Ottomans during World War I. Instead, they sided with the British. So that's another reason.
Thank you, Islam, for your question. Hope you got your answer right. Hope you understand what our professor is telling you. Okay, now if we don't have any question, maybe we can finish the class, inshallah. Do you have anything to ask or to discuss? Maybe we can finish the class.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for listening and being here. Hope to see you and tell you some things about the Middle East again. And I'll talk to Abdul Shukur about it. Thank you for being here.
Ji, thank you so much,
Thank you so much.
dear
Thank you
professor.
so much, ma'am.
Yeah, welcome always. We are appreciated to you.
Thank you so much.
It is a big
We are
opportunity
getting
to hire
understand.
as your lecturer. We are good luck. Nice see.
Guys, really
Actually, may I request, dear professor, to you, if you have free time, please, we are given some lecture about the political science. We have very important, especially our Rohingya student and teacher, very important political science to learn. We are not understand still what is the political science.
He's requesting you, if you have time, not now,
Mhm.
later on.
Yes.
You will need to later, you want to hear from you regarding
Political science? Oh, okay, okay.
It is helpful for us, our Rohingya students.
Okay,
Okay,
Inshallah, I hope that you
Inshallah.
are helping me. Inshallah.
Thank you so
Inshallah.
much.
Hope
See
that.
you next week. Bye bye.
Yeah, no.